All right, so today we're diving into something that might sound kind of boring at first glance, the Department of Education, but stick with us because this is going to get interesting, especially if you ever wonder about, like college costs getting out of control or who's really making decisions about education.
Mhm.
We're looking at an article called End the DOE. Get it? End the Department of Education.
Yeah.
It's from the Mises Institute.
Okay.
They're big on free markets, individual liberty, that kind of thing.
hmm
So we're going in knowing there's a specific viewpoint here,
Yeah.
but that's what makes it fun, right? We're going to unpack their arguments about what the DOE actually does and see if it's helping students or just creating a giant bureaucracy.
Yeah, definitely.
Before we get too deep, though, maybe you can give us some context about the Mises Institute. What's their whole deal? Why should we care what they think about education?
So the Mises Institute, they're all about the power of free markets to solve problems. And they're pretty skeptical about the government getting involved. They'd argue that a lot of times the government actually makes things worse by trying to fix them.
Okay, so less government's better.
Yeah.
That's their starting point.
Exactly.
Got it. So the first thing this article jumps into is the DOE's role in financial aid. And the numbers are kind of wild. Their budget has exploded since 1979. Like, it went from around $15 billion to almost $70 billion every year.
Mm.
But the article claims student outcomes haven't really improved that much. It makes you wonder, where is all that money going?
Right, and that's a perfect example of the Mises Institute's point. More government spending doesn't automatically equal better results. They'd argue that throwing money at the problem can actually mess up the education market and even make things more expensive.
That's interesting because on the surface, more financial aid seems like it would make college more affordable. But the article suggests the opposite. How does that work?
Okay, so think of it like this. Easy access to student loans means colleges can raise tuition prices because they know students can just borrow more to cover it. It's like giving everyone a discount coupon at a store.
Yeah.
The store just raises the original price, so you're not really saving anything. The Mises Institute argues that this easy money is actually what's driving up the cost of education.
So instead of making college more affordable, they're saying financial aid is part of the problem.
Yeah, that's their argument.
Yeah.
And they'd also point to all the student loan debt people have when they graduate. They see that as a direct result of this easy money policy.
Okay, so they're not fans of federal student aid.
Yeah.
What about the DOE's influence on what's actually being taught in schools? The article says they can't directly control curriculum, but they've found ways to influence it.
They can't tell states what to teach, but they can use funding as leverage.
That's kind of ironic, isn't it? Like, they're forbidden from controlling the curriculum, but they can use money to steer things the way they want.
Exactly.
The article brings up the Race to the Top initiative as a prime example. What was that all about?
So basically, the DOE offered billions of dollars to states. And they said, if you want some of this money, you got to adopt these specific education standards and assessments. It was supposed to be optional, but come on, how many states are going to turn down that kind of cash?
Right? It puts states in a tough position. Stick to their principles and maybe lose a ton of funding, or play the DOE's game.
Yeah, exactly.
The article even mentions how Texas Governor Rick Perry straight up refused to join Race to the Top. He saw it as federal overreach.
Right, and that's exactly how the Mises Institute sees the DOE operating. They argue that these programs force a one-size-fits-all approach to education, which they believe is harmful. They'd rather see decisions made at the local level where communities have more control over what their kids are learning.
So instead of top-down from the federal government, they want things more decentralized.
Right.
Interesting. Now, another big issue the article talks about is standardized testing. The Mises Institute doesn't seem too happy about that either, huh?
Not at all. They see standardized testing as part of this whole top-down, one-size-fits-all problem. They say these tests don't really measure true learning, and they encourage a teach-to-the-test mentality, which doesn't help students in the long run.
And they connect that back to the DOE's funding schemes, right? Like with No Child Left Behind, where schools had to participate in standardized tests to get federal funding. So schools felt pressured to teach to the test just to get the money.
Exactly. The Mises Institute would say that this messes up the education market because it creates incentives that aren't actually good for students. They think a truly free market in education would allow for more innovation and customization. Schools would compete to offer the best education based on individual needs, instead of trying to meet random government standards.
Okay, so we've seen how the Mises Institute views the DOE's role in financial aid and how they try to influence what's taught in schools. But they also have issues with how the DOE tries to shape the national conversation about education. Right, talk about that after a quick break.
Yeah, for sure. Right, so the Mises Institute, They don't buy into the DOE's attempts to identify and highlight what they see as the big problems in education.
Yeah, they call out stuff like the DOE's Listening and Learning Tour. Remember that, where officials went around the country having town halls meeting with educators.
Right, they think that's more about PR than actually fixing problems.
Yeah, the article kind of makes fun of those big, flashy initiatives. It's like they're saying those events are more about looking good than doing good.
The Mises Institute's main argument is that real solutions have to come from the ground up, not from bureaucrats in Washington telling everyone what's best.
So they're saying focusing on national issues could actually make the problem of standardized education worse
Yeah.
because you're ignoring those local differences.
Exactly. A one-size-fits-all approach just can't deal with all the unique challenges and opportunities in different communities.
Makes you think about the role of local school boards and parents. Should the folks closest to the students have more say in their education?
Absolutely. That's a big point for the Mises Institute. They believe parents and local communities are the best advocates for their kids, and they should have the power to make decisions about their schools.
Okay, so more local control.
Got it.
Now, what about all the research the DOE does? The article mentions they produce tons of data and studies, but the Mises Institute questions whether it's actually useful.
Yeah, they argue that a lot of that research is pointless, or private institutions could do it better. They point out that the market is often better at figuring out and meeting real needs.
They even call out some examples that sound kind of ridiculous, like spending millions of dollars to study the benefits of quizzes, or assigning biographies to get girls interested in math and science. Like, teachers already know this stuff, right?
Exactly. It shows how inefficient and wasteful things can get when a big agency like the DOE is in charge of research. The Mises Institute thinks a decentralized, market-driven approach would make research more relevant and impactful, because it would be driven by the needs of actual schools and communities, not just the priorities of a federal agency.
So instead of a big top-down research machine, we should let individual schools and organizations do research based on their own needs and challenges.
Right. They believe a more decentralized system would lead to more innovation and better results, because schools could experiment and find solutions that work best for them.
And it makes you think about the opportunity cost. What could we do with that $200 million research budget if it went back to taxpayers or was used differently? Could we fund innovative local programs, support teachers directly, provide scholarships to students?
Those are all good questions. The Mises Institute would say that money would be much better spent at the local level, where it could actually address the needs of individual communities, instead of going to a giant bureaucracy.
All right, so we've talked about three of the DOE's main activities: financial aid influencing curriculum and research. The last one the article focuses on is enforcing non-discrimination in education. Obviously, equal access to education is important, but the article suggests the DOE's approach might not be the best way to do it. What's their critique?
The Mises Institute agrees that equal access is important, but they say federal policies often end up treating all students the same. They ignore individual needs and fail to actually close the achievement gap. They think a one-size-fits-all approach, even if it's well-intentioned, can actually make inequalities worse because it doesn't consider the needs of different students.
So they support the goal of equal access, but they're saying the DOE's methods might actually be making things worse.
Yeah, they'd argue that a more individualized market-based system might do a better job at addressing the unique needs of different students. A system where parents have more choice and control over their kids' education would lead to more innovation and better results for all students, no matter their background.
That's a pretty radical idea. Moving away from a centralized system and going with a more market-driven approach to education, it's definitely something to think about. The article mentions data showing that even after spending trillions of dollars, the achievement gap between white students and minority students hasn't really changed much. They use that to suggest that maybe the DOE's interventions aren't working as well as they could be.
It makes us rethink the role of the federal government in education. The Mises Institute believes that a more decentralized, market-based approach where parents and local communities have more control would be better at closing the achievement gap and giving all students the education they deserve. They think that kind of system would create more innovation choice and accountability, and that would lead to better results for everyone.
So basically, the Mises Institute thinks the DOE's interventions are messing up the education market and not doing what they're supposed to do. They want to abolish the DOE and go with a more market-based, local approach that puts parents and local communities in charge. It's a bold stance, and it raises a lot of questions like, if not the DOE, then what? What would a truly good and fair education system look like?
That's the question they want us to wrestle with. They believe that by giving power to parents and local communities, we can build an education system that's more responsive to the needs of individual students and ultimately leads to better outcomes for everyone.
It's a fascinating perspective. Yeah. It definitely makes you question some assumptions about how education should work. We've been using this centralized system for so long that it's hard to picture anything else.
It is, but the Mises Institute wants us to at least consider the possibility that a different approach might actually be better for students. They think that decentralizing power and putting parents and local communities in charge would create an education system that's more responsive, more innovative, and ultimately more successful at preparing students for the future.
Well, I think this deep dive has definitely given our listeners a lot to think about, whether you agree with the Mises Institute or not. Their arguments make us think critically about how our education system works and if there might be better ways to do things.
Absolutely. It's important to have these discussions and look at different perspectives. In the end, we all want an education system that helps all students and prepares them for success in life.
Well said. Thanks for joining us today on this deep dive. It's been a great conversation. And to our listeners, if this got you thinking, be sure to check out the Mises Institute's article and the DOE. You can get a more in-depth look at their arguments there. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Yeah, it really is a different way to think about things. It's like imagining schools competing for students, like businesses competing for customers. That's a big change from how things work now.
It is a big change.
Yeah.
But the Mises Institute thinks that competition would actually make schools better. When parents have more choices, schools have to work harder to attract them. They have to innovate, improve their quality, and offer programs that families actually want.
So instead of this one-size-fits-all system we have now, schools would be more specialized and cater to different learning styles, interests, and needs. Kind of like how we have different restaurants for different tastes. Exactly. And just like with restaurants, parents could choose the school that best fits their values and their kids' needs. The Mises Institute believes this would create a more exciting and dynamic education system with way more options for parents and students.
But wouldn't that also mean some schools would just be better than others? What about the kids who end up in schools that aren't doing well?
That's a good point. But even in a market-driven system, there would still be oversight and accountability. Parents would need to be able to hold schools accountable for how they're doing.
So it wouldn't be a total free-for-all. There would still be standards and ways to make sure schools are doing a good job.
Right. And competition itself would push schools to improve. They'd want to get better to attract more students.
It's a lot to think about. It really makes you question everything you thought you knew about education. I mean, we've had this centralized system for so long that it's hard to imagine anything different.
It is, but the Mises Institute wants us to at least think about the possibility that another way might actually be better for students. They think that by giving power to parents and local communities, we can create a system that's more responsive, more innovative, and better at preparing students for what's next.
Well, I think this deep dive has given everyone listening a lot to consider. Whether you agree with the Mises Institute or not, their ideas make us think critically about our education system and if there might be better ways to do things.
I agree. It's important to talk about these things and consider different points of view. Ultimately, we all want an education system that works for all students and helps them succeed in life.
Well said. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive. It's been a really interesting conversation. And to everyone listening, if you found this thought-provoking, check out the Mises Institute's article and the DOE for a closer look at their arguments. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the ideas that matter.